I'm so glad to be here to talk about art today, but to talk about art in a way that's probably a little bit different from how we first think about it. When someone says art, you might think of a genius like Pablo Picasso or an experience like standing in front of Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project at Tate Modern. I'm here to talk about art as something much bigger, to give us a Swiss Army knife definition of art as a process of trusting ourselves, extending a little bit of grace toward ourselves to move forward when we don't have a template. Not just to go from point A to point B, but to be able to invent point B in any area of our life or our work. We actually live in the midst of many, many layered point B worlds that were created before us. And just to take a moment to pause and think about a couple of them, even in our lifetimes or in the last 5 or 10 years, we've come into a world of gay marriage, of evolving roles for women in the workplace, of even being able to take for granted something like air travel, to almost forget the wonder of the wingspan taking off of the airport, of the tarmac on your way to Malmö. And I think I'm not alone in trying to notice things as they're changing and finding it really hard. Seeing a chart like this in The Economist and asking myself if the structure of family and marriage and child rearing is changing fundamentally or not. Or more obviously, seeing the implosion of many political situations around the world, abhorrent racism, protectionist policies, fear. And I think it would be fair to say that this is live theater, that we are like crash test dummies in the clown car of democracy. And there's a huge list of ideas that are on the table for all of us. And some of them are quite scary, and some of them are questions of our capacity for meaning. And what I'm here to say is that art is a process of moving forward from questions. It's a process of moving forward into what we don't yet know. Often the question takes the form, wouldn't it be cool if, or this is really wrong and I want to try to make it better. And what I want to convince you of in the rest of this talk is that art is a container, that art is a container for independent thinking, and that independent thinking is the single greatest lever of power in a democracy. I also want to convince you that business models are the artistic medium of our time. And to start on that, let me tell you a story. On May 6th, 1954, this is a movie. Well, maybe we'll see part of it. Here we go. On May 6th, 1954, Roger Bannister was the first person in recorded history to run a mile in under 4 minutes. That may seem kind of normalized or obvious to us now. The current world record is 3 minutes, 43 seconds. But at the time, people thought it was physically impossible. There were 2 Swedish runners, Gunder Haag and Arne Andersson, who had vied for the title for 9 years, and they had gotten the time down to 4 minutes, 1.4 seconds. When Bannister started working on this, he actually did it from the ground of failure. In 1952, he had run for England in the Olympics in Helsinki. He had come in 4th place in his event, and he was really devastated not to medal. He considered very seriously giving up running entirely and decided instead that he would give himself 2 years. This is July 1952, and he ran the 4-minute mile, sub-4-minute mile in May of 1954. One of the other things about this video is that you may notice he's not running alone. He's doing this with the help of 2 of his friends, Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway, who are amazing runners in their own right. Brasher goes on to co-found the London Marathon, and Chataway goes on to win the world record in the 3-mile distance a year later. All of them have full-time jobs. Brasher works at Mobil Oil, Chataway is an underbrewer at Guinness. Bannister is a trainee doctor in neurology. He has it exactly timed to leave the hospital, get to the track, run his workout, get back, clean up, and have a sandwich, all on his lunch break. One of the things that I find most moving about this story, and I researched Bannister for a long time before I came across this film, and this film actually sometimes makes me want to cry. What I find moving is that he's going completely and totally all in before he knows it's possible to accomplish what he's trying to do. He's giving it everything he has, mentally and physically. And he does not know right now, as we're watching him run, that this is an extraordinary day. He almost doesn't even try to run the race this day. The weather is so bad, they almost give up. When there's a break in the wind, there's a false start, and they have to do it again. This is completely steeped in ordinary, everyday life. But it's transformational, and he does run in under 4 minutes, and overnight, he becomes an international sporting sensation. Here he is with Braysher and Chataway and Winston Churchill. So why is this a story of inventing point B? Well, I think it's a story of inventing point B because Bannister only held the record for 45 days. He opened up this portal of what was possible, and then someone else saw that it was possible and did incrementally better. And this is the nature of art as a process. And I want to talk about it in the context of both business and design. I mentioned that Bannister had to carve out time to train on his lunch break, and this is the nature of the relationship of art to business, which is that for better or worse, we live in the midst of a very complex market economy that makes it hard to hold space for things we don't yet know how to do or to produce. And that means that art's relationship to business is one of holding space. I also want to talk just briefly about the subtle differences between art and design. In some ways, these are academic, especially as speculative design flourishes, but fundamentally, art is about asking questions, and design is about refining solutions. Design is about doing something in the best possible way, and art is about taking the vulnerability risk of asking the question that matters most, whether you can answer it or not, no matter how big and messy it might be. And for that reason, I like to call these lighthouse questions, because they're the questions you ask to point yourself forward, sorry for the noise, to point yourself forward when you don't yet have a target in mind. You can move in the direction of what's important to you, but you don't yet know how to resolve the problem. And what this means is that sometimes the question itself is transformational. For example, the reason we live in a vast market economy is partly due to Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He never intended to found the field of economics. He was a Scottish moral philosopher who wanted to explore the history of the progress of man. He happened to be writing against a backdrop of mercantilism, the nation-state theory of hoarding as a way of generating wealth, and he made a case for trade instead. One of the ways to get started thinking about these lighthouse questions is to reverse engineer them from looking at films. If anyone here has written a screenplay, there's an idea of an MDQ, or a major dramatic question. So in a movie, there's the plot question, what will happen between Harry and Sally, but there's also an MDQ, can men and women really be friends? And that's the engine of the film. Can love transcend age? Or in the case of Harry Potter, can you be ordinary and extraordinary at the same time? What is really the banality or the grand drama of evil? And what this points out is that a lot of the questions that we face as MDQs or as lighthouse questions have an enduring nature to them. They're forms of grappling with meaning or fear or hopefulness, but they take these new forms. They require a kind of exacting restatement for the time that we find ourselves in. So I invite you to kind of think while I'm talking about what your own lighthouse questions are, whether the MDQ that's guided your life the last year or decade, or the lighthouse question in front of you now. Because one of the things that's really hard about asking a lighthouse question is that you immediately confront a perceptual bias, which is that when you're working on something and you haven't yet invented the point B world, you're in the weeds. And when you see other people's projects, you see them after the fact from the aerial view when they're shiny and perfect and we kind of understand them. And I love the illustration of this in Harper Lee's story of Writing to Kill a Mockingbird. This book has sold 40 million copies. It was an Academy Award-winning movie with Gregory Peck. When she wrote it, she was a college and law school dropout, and she worked as a reservations agent for the airlines when she moved to New York. There was one year in the late 1950s she couldn't get off work to go home for Christmas, and so she celebrated with some friends of hers, Joy and Michael Brown, and after they gave gifts to their children, they gave her a year's salary, which is what allowed her to write that book. This is one of the central tensions between art as a process and the market as a context, which is how you pay for R&D and how you hold space for that. So I want to make one point about management and one about investment. In the case of management, I think we have this idea of the guru, the Steve Jobs figure, who leads the creative charge. But I actually want to make a case for Donald Woods Winnicott, the British child psychiatrist who came up with the idea of the good enough mother. And I mean that in a gender-neutral, child, non-child friendly sense, that to be a good enough mother or a good enough manager, what you really need is to hold a safe space for people, a space that has a capacity for repair, and in which people can bring their whole selves and develop ideas. I also want to make a case for the side project. And the side project is really thinking about portfolios and investment. So not thinking about consumption and performance and what you have to get done, but thinking about how to hold even a small amount of space for things you really care about. When Leonardo da Vinci made the Mona Lisa, this was the side project. His main gig at the time doesn't survive. He experimented with materials and it fell off the wall. And the reason I think it's so important to hold this space for projects is that it sets a grace period. It gives you time and space in which to be disconnected from the market and from the necessity of performance. It gives you time and space to work on things without the pressure of having to get something done immediately. When the Wright brothers were trying to figure out how to get an airplane off the ground, someone asked one of them if they thought it was possible for humankind to fly. And he said yes, but not for 50 years. And then they actually got a plane off the ground 2 years later. And I've always thought that if they put pressure on themselves and didn't set a grace period, they might have invented a glider instead. So I want to tell you one quick story and then leave with the question that I actually started with. And the story is of a man named Thomas Fogarty, who I really love, actually. Thomas Fogarty is a cardiovascular surgeon in the Bay Area. He's owned a winery under his own name since the late 1970s. And he grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, as a self-professed juvenile delinquent who had to be busy or supervised. He used to jump out of the window of his school to go fly fishing. And so they agreed he needed a job, and the only reason he went to work in a hospital was because they were exempt from child labor laws, and he was only 13. He went to work for a surgeon named Jack Cranley, who, and this trigger warning, this is a little bit gruesome, who removed blood clots. And at the time, people truly believed the better the surgeon, the bigger the incision. And they would cut open the length of an artery. Many people died. Many people came back for secondary amputations. And Fogarty thought there has to be a better way, and he went and tinkered in his attic room. And what he did was he took a piece of urethral catheter and the pinky finger of a number 5 latex glove, and he reasoned that he could make a much smaller incision, thread that through, expand it, and pull a clot back out. At the time, this is the late 1950s, early 60s, there was no glue that would make latex and vinyl adhere, so he tied it together with the fly fishing knots he learned cutting school. That device has saved 20 million lives since it was invented and has normalized, or certainly helped to normalize, the field of non-invasive surgery. I want to make a point about the business side of this too, and the risk of this early stage of inventing point B normalization, which is that Dr. Cranley, his mentor, used it in a procedure, but he couldn't get anyone to make it. And he finally met Al Starr, the legendary heart surgeon who did the first valve replacement transplant in the human body. And Al Starr felt so sorry for him, he got it made. And they just copied Dr. Starr's contract and gave it to Thomas Fogarty. So he got this unheard of royalty that became very generative in his life. and led him to come up with 160 and counting further patents. As he likes to say, the balloon catheter was so long ago, people think I'm dead. They think I'm Tom Fogarty's son. So I want to put forward that this idea of a business model is really an important part of this artistic process. I teach business to artists in my daily life, and I always say that there are two layers of creativity. There's writing the letter and designing the envelope. And designing the envelope is the business model around the work itself. And I think that ownership, royalties, patents, thinking an investment, owning the upside of what you create is a really important part of how we construct business models around creative work. So just to close with Leonardo da Vinci, the person I started with, I think if he were alive today, he'd probably just be trying to figure stuff out, anything. And I actually think that he wouldn't just be one person. I think he would be all of us. And the central tension with this is that we live in a time of siloed knowledge, of not 11 majors in college, but 65 and counting. And we also live in a time of the proliferation of information. So I leave you with two things. One thing is an encouragement to do what I would call the periscope move, which is the vulnerability risk of stepping outside your internal thought process to connect with other people, because complexity is only solved in conversation. And the other is to consider the, I think, worst form of failure, which is to succeed and then realize you've asked the wrong question. And so I invite you to think of what your Lighthouse question is and to try as best we all can to invent the point B worlds we really want to live in. Thank you.